Hello, we are here in the Chester Museum. Behind me is part of our current exhibit, which is taking a look at the last 50 years of historic preservation in Jonesborough by focusing on the contributions of groups like the Historic Zoning Commission and the Jonesborough Civic Trust. So today, what I wanted to look at specifically are brochures and the role that town tour guides and brochures have played in Jonesborough's preservation efforts and the history of Jonesborough that is preserved and conveyed to the public. So let's actually start in the present. This is the most recent version of the Jonesborough sort of town tour brochure, the official walking tour of the town, and like many of the older versions, features spotlights on specific buildings. Now, before we get to the details of this one, the role of the town tour brochure has been really integral into Jonesborough's preservation efforts. So one of the things that you can learn when you're looking at preservation is how much it tells about the present as much as it does about the past. So for example, the snapshots of each of these brochures captures Jonesborough at a specific time. Now, most of these are within the same 50 to 60 year window, so it's not a whole lot of variance over time, but you can use them. You can use these specific brochures to learn about not just Jonesborough's past, but the present at the point that these brochures were created. For example, this brochure right here, which does not have a date on it, we can date to a specific time period because of things that are not here. So there's no mention of the visitor center. There's no mention of the Washington County History Museum. The Chester Inn at the time, as described in this brochure, was owned by Charles Bennett. So the Christopher Taylor House, which is next door to the Chester Inn, had already been moved. So it's safe to say that this captures Jonesborough sometime in the mid-late 1970s. Now, this brochure features a lot of different buildings and information, but also includes a map of the town, or at least of the roughly the downtown area. This is a staple of most of the brochures, walking tour brochures that you see about the town. So what you see here is a snapshot of the process of not only preserving Jonesborough's history, but making it to where the public gets that same information. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the brochures that came out, especially when Jonesborough was getting really into the preservation movement in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of the earlier brochures highlighted key figures that would have some national prominence or regional prominence. So someone like Andrew Jackson, for example, or Andrew Johnson feature prominently in some of the stories here about the town and specifically the buildings that they're attached to. For example, the story about the Chester, or the description of the Chester Inn Museum in this brochure features a story about Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson, and includes the description that there were threats of mob violence that broke out at the Chester Inn or around the Chester Inn based on just the presence of those two. So you see the use of a nationally known figure and a sort of sensational story about them to ignite an interest and spark an interest in someone who's traveling here who might not otherwise know the area. So that is a useful tool. The use of stories, interesting stories, stories about well-known people that can attract interest in people who are coming into the town. One of the things that you also see with some of the older brochures is not just stories about national figures like Andrew Jackson, but also things sort of thrown in about buildings, such as the presences of ghosts. So you see that storytelling element that's so famous to Jonesborough worked into some of the history brochure early on. As the process progresses and the histories are refined and sort of evolve over time, you see a lot more emphasis in the brochures here about the town on specifically pretty straightforward factual history. You also see the emphasis on architectural history and styles. That's a recurring theme throughout most of the brochures and the preservation process in the town. Now, the current version of our brochure also captures Jonesborough as it exists now at a specific moment. So it does highlight the history of buildings and specific buildings, but also highlights things such as Jonesborough's tourist economy. It highlights the things that you can do here. Also highlights the small business aspect of the town, which is a much more integral part to Jonesborough today than it was maybe 50 years ago. So again, this is something that you can use as a historic tool to understand not only the past about Jonesborough and the stories about Jonesborough's past, but also the present as Jonesborough existed when these brochures were created.